So the Clippers just extended Ty Lue, making him one of the highest paid coaches in the league. And according to Woj, they are determined to keep Paul George and James Harden as they head into the new arena, which sounds kind of crazy to some people that they want to continue running it with this team because of the general lack of success they've had and the fact that this team is getting much older. Money's never been an issue for this organization. They've been willing to spend as much as possible to have the team be as strong as it can be, but that seemingly unlimited budget has led to CBA changes that's going to make it harder for high spenders like the Clippers from improving the roster. But look, we've had 5 years of this now. I think when they put the team together, they realistically only had 5 years to win a championship, and the past four playoff runs have been injury plagued. Kawhi Leonard has either not been able to play in the playoffs or not complete them. And if we're being honest, the Clippers are definitely at the biggest crossroads out of any team trying to compete for a championship right now. It really feels like the league has passed this group by. It doesn't make sense to pay Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, James Harden top dollar going forward. But I think the Clippers are aware of all this. I'm sure they're reading what everyone is saying, and they're definitely going to run it back for now because the alternative isn't great. But I do get the feeling that despite that, doesn't mean that they're going to be committing to this group for the next 3 to 4 years. They might even be plotting their exit in the near future. So I want to go over what all those team building restrictions are to show just how hard it is for the Clippers to build upon this roster, talk about some alternatives to show why they got to run it back for now, and then kind of get into how they could potentially look to reshuffle the deck or enter a full rebuild in the future. But before I get into all that, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's still a relatively new channel and it will help a lot with my growth. But first, let's take a quick look at the Clippers payroll heading into the offseason. I've got Paul George with that player option for now. He's expected to decline it so he can re-sign for a max. But even if he does, his first year salary would be the same as Kawhi Leonard. So it's already in the same range. I think PJ Tucker is going to opt into his player option. And I'm going to assume the same thing for Russell Westbrook. There's been some rumors that he might want to opt out to get a better opportunity elsewhere. But I'm just not sure where that is right now. So right now, they are well below the $189.5 million second apron, but they're going to exceed it once they re-sign James Harden. And once they do exceed it, that is when those team building restrictions kick in. They're not going to be able to take in more salary in a trade than they're sending out. They're not going to be able to combine multiple players in a trade to get a more expensive one. They're also not going to have any significant spending exceptions. Like they're not going to have any form of the mid-level exception. They're basically going to be limited to re-signing their own players, draft picks, or signing minimum players to fill out the rest of the roster. Now, the other thing about the second apron line is that if they finish the season over that $189.5 million amount, they would have these draft pick penalties where their first round pick 7 years in the future is going to be frozen from being traded. And if they finish over it again in one of the next few years, that same pick will fall to the end of the first round. And I think the Clippers would like to prevent that if possible. So that designation is only made at the end of the season if they finish over it. So they still have a chance to get under it if they decide to do a major pivot. Now, before I get into projecting the Clippers roster and payroll, I want to go over some projections for how much Paul George and James Harden are likely to make. So this is the maximum contract that Paul George can sign with the Clippers this summer. This is also pretty close to the maximum he can get if he leaves. If he does, it's roughly $9 million less over 4 years, so pretty insignificant difference if he chooses to go to a different team. Now, there have been some reports that the Clippers are only offering Paul George 3 years, $150 million, which is the equivalent of what they just extended Kawhi Leonard to. And it's also been reported that he's seeking the full 4-year maximum contract that he can get. And there's teams like the Sixers are rumored to be interested in giving that to him. So he might have some leverage to getting it from the Clippers. So he could also extend for this amount before free agency begins. However, there are two big differences, mainly that if he does the extension, he can only add up to those first 3 years versus that extra fourth if he hits free agency. But the biggest difference is that if he opts out and enters free agency, he could also add a no trade clause in his new contract with the Clippers. That would give him the right to veto any trade involving him over the lifetime of that contract. So I highly doubt the Clippers want to give him that. And that could be a major sticking point since I think he wants to stay in LA for the rest of his career. Unlike Paul George, though, James Harden isn't extension eligible. He will have to get his next contract with the Clippers as a free agent. He recently forced his way out of Philadelphia because partly they didn't want to commit to him so they could prioritize all these cap space options this summer. He could have been on a max contract right now, earning over $50 million a year had he extended with the Nets, but he chose not to because he didn't want to be there less than a year into his tenure. The days of him getting that level of salary are gone. So I think he's most likely looking at a salary range at around what he's currently making. So here's a projection I made on what that could look like. Roughly $35 million a year on a short-term deal. I think that's reasonable for him. Pretty similar to what Drew Holiday just extended with the Celtics. Now, I think in any deal with the Clippers, they are probably going to limit him to 3 years. I think they want to keep him aligned on Kawhi Leonard's timeline, who's also under contract for the next 3 years. He could potentially get a little more annually than this, but I also think it is likely more than the market's going to be offering him. So let's plug in those figures I made for Paul George and James Harden and see what the roster looks like. I've got them filling out the rest of the roster with minimum signing so they could enter the season with 14 players, which is required. And when you put it together, their luxury tax payment exceeds $140 million and the total roster expenses exceed $340 million, which seems like a lot, but that is on par with how much they spent last season. Now, as you can see, they are well above both apron levels, about 17 million above the second apron. So now the big question is it possible for the Clippers to get below the second apron while keeping their big three? And to do that, they would probably need to either trade Norman Powell without taking any money back, which would make them a lot worse. Or you can try to combine PJ Tucker and a couple other smaller salaried guys, but that would probably cost a lot of assets, and the Clippers don't really have the luxury of giving out assets just to save money and get under the second apron. So I truly think that if they really need to get below the second apron, the most realistic way to do that is by either trading or not re-signing one of Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, or James Harden. So now I want to go over two scenarios to show why I think the Clippers have to bring back their big three heading into the season. So let's say one of Paul George or James Harden leaves. Do they have enough cap space or flexibility to replace them? And the answer is no. So here's a projection I made where Paul George leaves. Let's say he ends up opting out and signing a max contract with the Sixers. They would still be about 13 million over the salary cap. So that's not an option. They cannot just let one of these guys go. They cannot afford to do that. And then here's a scenario where the Clippers are able to sign and trade for someone to replace someone in their big three. So according to Hoops Hype's Michael Scotto, the Clippers are looking at DeMar DeRozan as a potential backup in case Paul George leaves. So let's say he does, and they're able to construct a multi-team sign and trade where they send out Paul George and bring back DeMar DeRozan. And if they're going to be doing that, they'd be acquiring DeMar DeRozan as a free agent in a sign and trade. They're going to have to be able to finish under that $178.7 million first apron because you get hard capped to that amount if you sign and trade for a free agent. So one, I'm going to plug in DeMar DeRozan at his same salary as last year. Maybe he gets more, maybe he gets less, but just for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to plug him in at that amount. I also have PJ Tucker getting traded out in the same deal because they'll need to save some more money if they're going to finish below the first apron. So I conducted the trade. I've got them filling out the roster. And when you put it all together, they are able to finish just under that $178.7 million first apron amount. But I think that this is probably worse for them. Yeah, they save roughly $150 million in tax and payroll, but one, the team is way worse. And two, there's already several teams reportedly willing to give Paul George a max contract right now. So if that's true, then wouldn't he retain trade value going forward? I just think it'd be better to keep him at the max at that point. Now, there is one scenario I'm partial to where if the Clippers do trade Paul George and get another player back, it'd be Brandon Ingram. So let's say they're able to construct a multi team sign and trade where they're sending out Paul George and they bring in Brandon Ingram. He's got a trade bonus that, if traded this summer, would raise the salary to 41.4 million. And the thing to keep in mind is that if the Clippers trade one of their free agents, in which case Paul George, and they're taking back another existing contract, then they would be hard capped to that second apron. They wouldn't be able to exceed that $189.5 million amount. So I also have them offloading PJ Tucker. He's no longer on this cap sheet. And when they fill out the roster, they finish just below the second apron. So the reason I really like this scenario is that, one, if you already like DeMar DeRozan, you might as well go for a much better younger version in Brandon Ingram. Number two, if you are trying to reshuffle the roster in a way where if you lose Paul George and you want to stay good, Brandon Ingram is one of the better players available that you can get. And then number three, if things don't work out, then you have another player who should retain a lot of trade value in case you do have to enter a full rebuild. Now I've got three players that, even like 5'6", if you look at Norman Powell, Ivica Zubac, Terrence Mann, that all should have good trade value if you want to start accumulating assets for the next iteration of the Clippers team. Now, I could be wrong about this and maybe even misreading stuff, but I do see some parallels with the Blake Griffin situation and the way the Clippers ended that iteration of the team they had back in 2017, 2018. They gave him a max contract despite just trading away Chris Paul. And I could see the Clippers making that type of pivot midseason despite bringing back everybody. Maybe they start by trading Paul George midseason and they just get, a couple, one or two first round picks, couple of players to keep them halfway decent, and just go on from there and see what else they could do. Now, I don't think the Clippers would just enter a full-blown rebuild just because they may have traded Paul George in the future. Obviously, Kawhi Leonard is a big factor in things, and unless he explicitly says that he doesn't want to be there anymore, they're probably going to do what they can to reshuffle the deck and keep the team competitive around him. So then it's, are they able to get someone for Paul George that keeps the roster just as good or even better? Or are they able to parlay him into assets that they're able to then trade later for someone that does help improve the team? And whether it's now or the trade deadline or maybe a year from now, I do think, for all the reasons I laid out, there is a very good chance that this Clippers team as we know it slowly starts to break apart.